So, welcome everybody and good afternoon to the England Green Infrastructure Mapping Database version 1.2 deep dive. We've got about an hour and a half this afternoon, and what I'm going to do is to talk through the actual mapping, partly a few slides to start with, and then we'll go across to the site and go through most of the material. This pretty much even for an hour and a half these days. The key constraint today will be my voice, which is a bit croaky. At half an hour, it starts to get a bit ropey. So we'll kick off and go whilst the going's good. I'll probably talk about 50 minutes, 55, and then we've got about half an hour or so for the Q&A. So if you have questions as we're going through, don't expect you to remember all the stuff as we do go through it, then pop them in the Q&A, and we'll pick up on the more popular ones, I guess, in the Q&A session. Anything we can't answer today, we will take away and seek to provide answers later on. But for those who don't know me, I am Martin Moss, Senior Advisor in Green Infrastructure at Natural England, and I lead on the development of the England Green Infrastructure Mapping. So just a little word from our sponsors, as it were. The mapping itself has two big context into which it fits. The first one is the England Green Infrastructure Standards Framework, which was published back on the 31st of January this year, but it's also part of the Natural Capital and Ecosystems Assessment Programme. So on the one hand, it's there to support the rollout of the standards as a key piece of policy, if you like, and on the other hand, it's part of a broader effort cross-DEFRA organisations to improve the evidence base around our ecosystems and natural capital. So it's not a standalone project, it fits into other contexts. It's important, I think, we begin by understanding, and apologies for those who might have seen these before, but we do have some objectives behind this. There's a rationale for what we're trying to achieve here. And the first one of those objectives is to be publicly accessible. Open data about green infrastructure at an England scale. This is a national mapping project. So yes, it has relevance at local level, but crucially, it has to operate at an England scale. Everything on the site and everything in the data downloads that we provide is open government licensed data. That means you can have it, you can use it, you can change it, you can distribute your results. All you have to do is credit us. It's about as open as it gets in terms of data licensing these days. And we want to provide this open data in order to ensure that across England there is common access to at least this level of data. No area from now on has less access to evidence about green infrastructure than is being provided here. There are places with more, and there's always the opportunity to improve and to add local data, but this is the baseline. Below this, you don't need to go. It's there to provide evidence to support a range of national to local planning, strategy and targeting needs. So what should the plan say, what should the strategy say, and where should we target our efforts? It particularly works at an England to local authority level. We do provide data. The mapping goes down to multiple and lower super output area, but I constantly have to tell people the closer you get to the ground, the more you need to ground truth this. When you get to an LSOA level, there's a statistical probability that, for example, the data may or may not be correct. For some, it's actually, because of the way we've had to do this, for some it will be at variance with reality on the ground. With others, it will be probably close to the situation, but always ground truth here. So therefore, we provide the data to be able to download and place into a GIS environment to modify, to improve, to add local data, to improve the accuracy with local knowledge, and to suit your local mapping requirements. It gets you maybe 60 or 70% there, but you have to put in that sort of 30 or 40% effort to get to something which you're going to be able to use. It's all about understanding change. Just take a slip of water, forgive me a second. So we want to understand what's happening to our green infrastructure. It's not a static thing, it doesn't stand still, it changes over time. We need to understand that change in terms of what sorts of things are changing out there, where it is changing in terms of location and distribution, and crucially how that's affecting people. Green infrastructure, I refer to it as a social environmental infrastructure. It is there to do a job. So crucially, we want to understand, is it doing that job? Is it doing that job in the right place? And under that, we also wish to understand increasingly change in the underpinning ecosystem. With the green infrastructure work, we have a particular focus in this case on the urban ecosystem, but we wish to understand the sort of composition and the diversity of the underpinning urban ecosystem on the basis that a healthy green infrastructure probably requires a healthier ecosystem in order to work properly. If you've got a problem in the infrastructure, it almost certainly reflects a problem in the underpinning ecosystem. So what's in 1.2? If it's green, it's blue, and it's about access. These have been the key focuses for version 1. We are expanding the context and content as we go forward into version 2. But for this version, there has been a particular focus on piecing together information about green infrastructure assets, blue infrastructure assets, and access infrastructure assets. There are now 13 different modules, which we're going to go through on the site. So you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to go through this site. We will come back to this content in a few minutes. But before we do, I just want to mention version progression. Why we're doing this is it's not a sort of start, finish, publish and walk on to the next project sort of a thing. Version 1.1, some will remember, was published back in December of 2021. This is the first upgrade, version 1.2. Actually put those two together, we now have what I call baseline version 1. And as that is locked down, and it is now locked down, we won't do any further changes to it. We've been working on version 2 actually for a little while. So version 2 will be developed over the next few years. That itself will be locked down in probably March of 2025, and we will begin a change detection process to see, can we see what's changed and where it's changed between version 2 and version 1. In the interim, we're hoping to publish, I'm saying here in December, it's more likely to be January 24, the first iteration of version 2, version 2.1. So end of this year, beginning of next, there will be another opportunity for a deep dive to talk through the expanded information in version 2.1. But whilst the voice is good and we have time, we will go across now to the actual green infrastructure site and the mapping upon it. But before we do, I just want to point out, I'm going to start not with the maps, but with the user guide. So if you'll just forgive me for one moment whilst I cut across to the user guide. So here we are on the green infrastructure website, the web portal. And you'll see there are various tabs at the top here, one of which is for the mapping. We'll be taking a look at that in a minute. And one of which is for the mapping guide, or the user guide, as it's called. And if we bring that up, there are basically 4 sections. The bottom section, how to use the map, tells you about the functionality of the actual site. So if you want to know how the site actually works and how you can use it, then that's the section for you. I'm going to highlight the introduction here first, not for the content particularly, but for this little link here. We are getting questions. We get questions all the time about, can I get the data? Where can I get the data? The answer to that question is section 1, page 1, right at the top, there's a link there to data.gov.uk. You click on there, that takes you directly to where you can download the data. So if you were wondering, can I get the data? The answer is yes. It has been a bit delayed. I apologise if you've been trying to get the data over the last sort of month or so. We had a few technical glitches. We've solved them now. The data's there. It's ready for you to get hold of. We've also got a section on the source data. This is the data that we've used to do the work that we have. But principally, the most of the meat of the user guide is in this section here. So the mapping module descriptions. This is a very handy and concise user guide. It's only about 16,000 words big. So if you were short of something to read, you could possibly start here. It just literally takes you through section by section, the mapping that we'll see in a minute, in a structured way. So there's information about what the layer actually is. This is an explanation of what is this map trying to show. There's an explanation of the data that was used to create that map. There's an explanation of the attributes. When you click on a polygon, up comes an information box. Some of them are self-explanatory, some of them aren't. So there's information in there of what am I actually looking at in those cases. And then there is a section for each one about limitations and caveats to content. I suspect we try to anticipate as many questions as we can about what you might want to ask about this map and the sorts of things that you probably need to know in order to understand it, particularly if you're going to use it. Probably answers most questions. So if you do have a question, please check here first. There will be an accompanying method statement, another 16,000 words on the way. That will emerge as a formal Natural England evidence report. It's grinding its way through the system at the moment. So it is a little bit delayed, but we hope to get that out in the near future, which goes into much more technical detail about how we actually developed the content in terms of the methods. So as you can see, there's the menu on the left-hand side here. If you just click on one of these, it will take you directly to the section that you're particularly interested in. So here we are. It describes what that layer is. It tells you where the data came from. It tells you what the attributes are to in this case, the actual linear polygons. And then information about limitations and caveats. In this particular case, there's a great long list of where we don't actually have data. So if you're on this list, you're not on the map, and so on. So without further ado, let's have a look at the actual maps. So here we are back on the site. We're on this tab here, the map. And there are various tools, as you can see. There is a measurement tool, and there's a tool you can use if you've got your postcode or if you've got the name of the place you're interested in. Then you can just put it in here, and I'll do one now. And it will take you straight there. So I will use this little location, which is one I know pretty well because I live here, to illustrate a lot of the actual maps themselves. And you can see all the modules are on the left-hand side here. They're called accordions, so they're collapsible up and down. What you'll notice at the moment is that the order in which they are on the map part of the website is different to the way they'll be set out in the user guide. We didn't quite have time before launch to synchronize these things. We will sort that out, but all the content that is here is also in there in some order or other, and they are structured around certain modules focus on what I would call core data, so asset-based data. So we've got green and blue asset-based data in this module here. We have linear access data in here, and then we also have blue infrastructure data in there, and we use these predominantly as source data to fuel various different assessments that we do, including the one here. So for example, the access to natural green space standards. So we combine environmental data sets with socioeconomic ones sometimes if we want to know about population data. So we have reference layers on population data in here, and we also have other reference layers about different environmental or spatial data sets that are of use, including, for example, local authority boundaries, which you can pull up. Starting at the top, however, we have what we call map 1. So this really is the meat, veg, gravy, and pretty much pudding as well of the mapping website. In here, we've pulled together information about green infrastructure assets from a range of different data sets with a huge doffing of the cap in the direction of the Ordnance Survey, but we have other things in here as well. And as you can see instantly, there are lots of coloured polygons. It's based on the typology. The typology is set out here. Different sorts of spaces. If we click across, we can see there are gaps on the map. This is sort of a gap over here. This is predominantly the farms landscape. At the moment, we don't have much information that will cover these sort of contexts. That may change over time, but where it's blank, we don't have information, or we don't have information that we can show you, because over here in the urban environment, we also have some blank areas, and that's because we can't show you the data which exists in here. It's not open data. So the fact there is a blank doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing there. It just means that either A, we haven't got around to looking at it, or B, it's not open data and we can't show you on the site. You can get a handle on whether or not there should be something there by looking at the greenness grid. So we've created a grid, a 250 metre square grid across the whole of England, and we've codified it on a decile basis as to how much, it's actually called greenness, but it actually measures the percent man-made surface in each individual square. So if we click on one here, that tells us it's less, it's in the first decile, about 7% of it is some form of man-made surface. And if we go to here, then about 95% of it. And just as an aside, I will take you somewhere. Give me for a moment. 4, 3, A, Q. If you ever wondered where green infrastructure ground zero is, it's right here. I think it's this one. No, maybe that one. Yeah, this one here. This square is 100% man-made surface. It's in Manchester city centre, and not only that, but right now I'm sat right here in that building. So I'm in a Natural England office in green infrastructure ground zero in England today. There are very few 100% squares around. There are a few in major industrial areas. If you actually pull up the aerial imagery, you can see there is something there. But in this square, it is pretty much accurate. There is nothing green, or pretty much nothing green, outside of a few street trees. So if you wanted to know where ground zero was, you've seen it. We'll go back to a much nicer place. Up in Bury. So take that back down and bring up the asset maps again. If you click on any of these polygons, what comes up on the left-hand side is the information box, which gives you the attribute information I was mentioning earlier. So for this map, it tries to tell you some basic information about that polygon, including what code it is in terms of typology, what the name of that is. So in this case, this is a public park. Public park general is because there are also country parks, so this differentiates the two. It has a naturalness factor. We've used an amended system from Nature Nearby, which is 10, 15 years old now. Most natural is 1, least natural is 4. We've only done 1, 2, and 3, and we've amended it so that most natural these are likely to be places which are experiencing the lowest level of sort of management activity or apparent management activity. Management intensity 2, like parks, is pretty mixed. There's probably all sorts of different things going in there, and a 3 would be quite an intensively managed space, for example, a playing field or something like that. So what we also pull out for each polygon is the percent man-made surface. All these polygons cover the entire area that the data says is one thing or another, within which there are potentially a variety of different things, including some sealed surfaces. They could be roads, they could be paths, they could be hard standings, they could also be buildings. If we zoom in on this one in particular, I can tell you for certain there's a building here. In fact, it's a cafe. There are a range of buildings here which support these activity spaces. There are various paths, concrete ones, tarmac ones, and here, this corner there, that's also a car park. So this is not all plants, waters and soils. It does contain some hard infrastructure as well, but this tells you just about how much there might be in there. So if we click on this over here, we can see that's gone up to 17.27. If we click on that one over there, 38.76. You do get occasional ones which are 100%. That means it's a building. It's included in the data. It's got a code, but actually it's not green infrastructure. And this is how you can tell. If it's 100%, then that is a building. In addition to that, and what really is important to understand is we apply what I call data integrity. So we've put together a range of different spatial data sets which describe the same place in the same time, as it were, but not necessarily quite in the same way. If we click on this one, we can see this has got a multiple entry. This is a public park general, but it's also a public park country park. It's a designated country park, but you can see the attributes are slightly different, and that's because the two boundaries of these two spaces from these two different data sets don't quite agree, and that's quite often the case. If we click on this one here, it will also tell us quick one over here, I think it's this one. This also appears in 3 data sets. So what this is telling you is it's a woodland, it's also a woodland, and it's a woodland, and it's also access land. But why do I need to know it's 3 woodlands? The reason for that is it's actually coming through 3 different data sets. So it is woodland in the OS data set, it's woodland in the National Forest Inventory, and it also happens to be ancient woodland. And in fact, somewhere in that polygon, there is also some access land. So if you do get overlaps, you can't necessarily see them very well. If you click on the polygon, it will tell you in the information box how much and what that sort of overlap is. So I'll just clear that. Of all the stuff that we have, therefore, one of the questions we've been particularly anxious to answer is how much of this is actually accessible. Not everything is. These are assets for various different reasons, some of which are publicly accessible, but not all. So which ones are? We've created the accessible green infrastructure layer to map out those where they are what we call publicly accessible. It is important to understand what that means. If it is described as publicly accessible in this mapping, it means either A, its primary land use is public access, such as a public park, or B, there is a statutory right of open access, such as provided by access land, or C, it's a space that would normally be publicly accessible. You'd normally expect to be able to go in there, such as a public cemetery. There are exceptions. So for example, with cemeteries, some of them are public, some of them are private. So a percentage of the cemeteries that we map as accessible aren't. Local knowledge would be able to sort that one out at an England level. It would take forever to do it. But these are all the polygons that we deem to be publicly accessible based on the available information. That information has gaps in it. The OS are aware of that, and we're aware of that. And over time, those gaps will be filled. So we do have what I call missing assets. But as far as we can identify, comprehensively and across at an England scale, we've got what we've got, and that's what we're using. So if you just click on each one, all it will tell you is how big that is, and that's because what we've had to do, because of the overlapping polygon issue, we've condensed all that into one combined polygon of all the land which in any data set is described or we've assessed as publicly accessible. We use this as source data, for example, to fuel the Accessible Natural Green Space Standards Assessment, which we'll come to in a minute. Before we do, there is some information, for example, about woodlands and access. I'll zoom into an area here. We're not going to do more, we want to do more on woodlands, but there is some national work currently going on looking at access on woodlands, which we're going to wait to see what comes out of that before doing any further work. This is very much preliminary. All we've really done is taken all the woodlands that we can identify through the source data, and we've assess them for, is it accessible? In other words, is it within a polygon that is accessible green infrastructure? Yes, no. If yes, we class it accessible. If it's not, like this one, then we class it as not accessible. It might actually be accessible if you go there and see the conditions on the ground, but we can't tell that from the data that we have. And there are woods where the actual woodlands are accessible, but there are linear rights of access or that go through it, which will give you that sort of woodland experience. For example, here there is a linear access corridor that will be a right of way going through that woodland. So that shows you there is a corridor which takes you through the wood, but outside of that corridor, that woodland itself, as far as we can tell, is not accessible. We've done the greenness grid. We do provide information. It's not just about what's accessible, it's all about other forms of asset as well. So information on private gardens is not open. So what we've done is to extract information from OS Greenspace. We are probably going to use MasterMap in the future directly, and we've summarized it at an LSOA level. So for each LSOA across the country, we've worked out how much, according to the data, how much private garden area there is. So in this particular one, 107,000 or so square meters, and we've also worked out how much that is per person based on the population of that LSOA. That's because LSOAs are massively variable. You can see they're all different sizes. There are big ones and there are small ones. So that's a big one which actually has less garden space than this small one over here. You can't really compare therefore across the boundaries. So this measure of amount per thousand people or amount per person, if you take the decimal point down, gives you some means and ways of comparing actual supply per unit of population across LSOA. So in this case it's about 27 square meters each. In this case it's about 42. If we go over here it's going up to 156 and so on. What we also need to point out is that this data is not universal, so it's an urban data set only. So when you get into rural areas, at the moment we don't have data. We will in the future, we're working on that, but this provides information about urban gardens only, and at the edge of the urban area where you've usually got large peri-urban, urban fringe LSOAs, you start to get some distortions. So you do need to sort of watch out for that. A small amount of data exists in one corner of the LSOA, but the actual numbers are derived for particular population numbers are derived for the whole of the area. We've added in this time information on access points. So if I zoom in to find some green spaces, again, I'll go back to where I know. Up here, come on. So if we bring up the accessible green infrastructure map again, these are the accessible green spaces. I know this one very well. Actually, you can't just walk through from here to here. These are fenced off. There are particular access points. So we've input access point information for each of the green spaces for which it exists, so you can see where you can actually get in there. The reason that's important is if you, at a local level in particular, want to understand actually how accessible is this. People can't necessarily just walk from A to B into the space. You have to go through the access point. You have to use the network of routes within, that neighbourhood to get from perhaps where you live to the actual space itself. So this shows you where people can get in. It's not ultimately comprehensive. There are some missing ones. I know this space very well. I know there's an access point missing there. So there's a margin for error. We have also added in, this is mostly OS data, but we've added in information about access land. So there's a huge wrap on the wrist for Natural England here. Whilst we mapped and designated the access land some years ago, we didn't produce a map of the access points to it. So we've had to recreate to an extent where we think some might be. So if the boundary of access land is crossed by a right-of-way, we've mapped that as an access point. But if the right-of-way, as in this case, goes along the side of the access land, it doesn't show anything up. So there are actually access points in here, but they don't show up in the data. So it's a partial data set. Again, local knowledge, you'll be able to supplement that one. So, okay, those are the asset layers. I'll now take a look at the accessible natural green space standards assessment. So using the new system of 6 different standards, we've assessed which spaces and are buffered by different size and distance criteria. So the most local one is what we call the doorstep standard. If you click on this little eye, information comes up about what that is. So the doorstep angst standard is a green space of at least 0.5 of a hectare and a buffer of 200 meters around it. And the largest one, sub-regional, is a 500, at least 500 meter green space with a 10-kilometer buffer around it. What we're trying to get here is an understanding of who does and who does not live within proximity of an accessible green space. And if we pull up the doorstep standard here, and I'll just pull up the accessible green spaces here, you can see these are the spaces which are over 0.5 in a hectare, and we've buffered them with a 200-meter buffer, and we can start to understand, okay, well, how many people live within this buffer around these green spaces? So how many people have access to the doorstep standard or are within the doorstep standard for green spaces? We can also then, well, okay, let's go at one to the local standard. So we're now at, again, at least 2 hectares and a 300-meter buffer, and we can add in also the neighbourhood standard, which is at least 10 hectares and a 1 kilometre buffer. And zoom out, we can start to see those places inside and outside of the buffers, and we can also measure what that means in terms of population. Important, however, to know, understand. If I zoom in, probably not a good example. Going back to the access points, the fact that you're in proximity doesn't necessarily mean that you can access it, because there are limitations to how people can go from A to B. If I just take down the definition, we can see here, for example, if I pull up the access points as well, here, like that, that if I'm in this area, actually to get from A to B, I'm going to have to go along the roads, cross over this main road here. This is a busy main road to get to an access point where I can actually get to the park. So whilst this is a 200-meter buffer, if we bring up the measuring tool, this is a good time to show the measuring tool. Let's say I live here, and to get to the park, I've got to go down to this road here. I've then got to go all the way down here. Oh, look, there's an access point. I could skip across the road, but actually, if I'm not very mobile, this is a very busy road. I'm taking my life in my hands. So I know I have to go up to here in order to get to the actual crossing point to cross the road. I'm already over 200 meters. So it's within proximity of 200 meters, but in terms of the network, it may take you longer to actually get there. Again, that's something you can start to address at a local level. If I'm particularly interested in access to that site, that's the kind of thing I want to do. At an England level, we have to generalize it by using buffers. Also in the angst assessment, we have what we call the angst profile, so we can start to understand those places which are in what buffers. So in this particular case, that spot I've just clicked on actually is covered by all of the 6 buffers, so it has the maximum sort of angst profile that we can have. If we go down to here, it's actually only in 3, that's 10, 1 and 2. So strategic access, strategic proximity looks quite good, but local proximity does not. So the next question is, actually, does that matter? This doesn't in itself tell you whether or not it matters, but it does start to beg the question, where should I be putting my effort if I want to improve access for various communities to accessible green spaces? Where am I going to target my effort? Is it down here? Is it over here, or is it somewhere else? And this kind of information may help you to target that effort. I mentioned, there are barriers. lots of different sorts of barriers. A busy road is a barrier. At England level, we can't look at every sort of physical barrier. We don't know where all. Well, we could find out where all the crossing points are and so on like that. But it's a major undertaking. So what we have done, we'll probably add to this over time, is to provide information on major barriers to access. In this particular case, it's railways and motorways. So if we bring up I'll bring up the local buffer, I think here. We can see that this buffer here, this combined buffer, is interrupted. It's severed by these major pieces of other forms of infrastructural kit. So if I've got a green space over here, but I'm living over here, it may well be that I can see it. I might even be able to smell it, but that doesn't necessarily mean I can get there. I have to have some means of ways of getting across that legally. So this starts to identify those places where, whilst populations communities may be in the buffer, there could be serious severances in the local system. That's railways and roads. If you bring up the blue infrastructure network map, we can also start to see where major watercourses might be providing another severance, another barrier, another impediment as well. We'll come back to that one a bit later. So that's the angst information. We have brought together a lot of information, therefore, about spatial assets, area-based green infrastructure assets. Access infrastructure isn't just area-based, it's not just green spaces, there are also, of course, linear assets. We focused on the public rights-of-way network, brought together information from all highway authorities across England that provide it in vector format as open data. Not all do. So when you do that, you can bring together the network map as you see here. So if we zoom in, if you click on an individual line, up pops the actual identifier for that route, and it'll tell you what the status is, whether it's public footpath, bridleway, byway, restricted byway, and so on. A lot of information in there, but we do have, as I've said, some gaps in the map. And if we bring up the public rights-of-way density map, we've also used a 1 kilometre grid to show the respective densities of the rights-of-way network across the country. So the darker the blue, the higher the density. Click on that square there. We've got total length of just under 8,000 metres. And if we click on over here, we've got 459 metres. And if we click here, we've got 0 metres. There are no recorded public rights-of-way in that square. If we zoom out, it won't. Sorry, I'll try that with the higher rights network. What we've also done, I'll come to the density for higher rights in a minute so we can see where the gaps are. We've taken out the footpaths and just retained the bridleways, the byways and the restricted byways to give some understanding of how much of the actual network permits other than simply walking activities. So if we have the total network here, you can see, looks huge, but if you actually take out those which are only footpaths, then the network looks a lot more restricted. There's a lot less of what are often referred to as the higher rights. And we've also created, therefore, a density map for the higher rights. This is based on 5 square kilometres, and I can zoom out for this one. And if we do, we can see there are cutouts where we don't have the data. So we can see those places where at the moment we don't have Highway Authority rights-of-way data. So Newcastle, I know that Middlesbrough, Stoke-on-Trent, I think that's Swindon, most of outer London, not all. Inner London, there are some places, the inner London districts don't maintain definitive maps, so there is no data anyway. So there will always be a gap there. But we still have some gaps we'd like to fill. And if you're one of these gaps and you've got vector data and you'd like to fill your gap with your vector data, please get in contact, because we'd love to talk to you. Well, knowing what the rights are or where they are and what their density is interesting, but what we're also starting to get interested in is some sort of quality-based information. So what's it like when you get there? So we've created, this is a bit experimental, what we've called the public rights-of-way experiential terrain mapping. So we're bringing together data derived from the Living England data set, which is a habitat probability map. It's therefore important to understand the data provided by the Living England map. On the one hand, it may say it's a grassland. There's a probability that it is a grassland. There's also a probability that it's been mistaken, it's been confused with something else. So it might be 80 or 90% certain, but there's a 10 or 20% probability that it's not. So there's margin for error in here. All data contains error. But we've also brought that together with information from the landscape description units, which unfortunately are not open data. So we can't show you them on the site. But if you click on an individual section of the right of way. This is quite detailed data. As you can see, the polygons are small. It brings up information about something to do with the physicality of that particular part of the route. So if I went there, what could I expect? This is saying it's probably a grassland underfoot experience, and the landform is rolling and undulating. And sometimes in here you get some physical information as well about how high is it, upland, is it elevated, or quite often it's just some basic geodiversity information. What sort of geology is underfoot as well, and it just gives you the length of that particular right of way. So clicking round, we have round here, there's quite a lot of grasslands, but if we went somewhere else away from the grasslands, we might find no, there's a lot of grasslands. Never find diversity in land cover when you need it. So woodland and scrub. Some of this is going through woodland and scrub. Some of it will be urban. Some of it will be arable, and so on like that. So starting to get information about the physical quality of the network and not just where it is. So leaving linear, I'll come back to this combined green space and rights of way assessment in a minute, because I want to talk about the blue infrastructure information we have first. But before I do that, I'm going to go somewhere where it's really, really interesting, and that's down here. So we've brought together a variety of data sets about the blue infrastructure network. So this is the rivers, streams, water bodies, and so on, and collated it into one layer. It's pretty comprehensive. It doesn't cover absolutely everything. I've found a few little water bodies and ponds and so on, even a few small water courses which aren't actually in this data, but it is pretty comprehensive. As open data, I doubt whether there's one which is more comprehensive. There is some non-open data which apparently is, but we can see this is our blue infrastructure network. One of the questions, as we asked with all the infrastructure assets, green infrastructure assets we have, how many are publicly accessible? We might ask the question of all the blue infrastructure that we have here, how much of that is accessible at least to the water side? So we've done an access to water side assessment, not the actual water itself. That's a different deal, maybe for the future, and mapped those parts therefore of the network which we think there's a probability that it is publicly accessible. It might not be when you get there, but there's a probability, a likelihood that it's accessible. And if we bring up this green, zoom in there, so where it's going green, these are the bits of the blue infrastructure network, I'll just switch off that we think are likely to be publicly accessible. So this side of that river along here and so on is likely to be accessible. This side of that river, as far as we can tell, is not accessible. And you see bits of it are and bits of it aren't. And the reason for that is we assess accessibility because either A, it's within 10 meters of a public right of way, or B, it's adjacent to or within a publicly accessible green space. So there's likely to be a path going along here like that, which goes close to the river within 10 meters at some points, but at other points it's not. You might find on the ground there is a path linking these up. Equally, you might find that there isn't, but as far as we can tell, these are the bits which are likely to be accessible. And we have also, whilst this works pretty well, we've done some testing and it does come out quite well, quite variable in terms of accuracy, but overall within 1%. We think we're underestimating by about 1% or so. In the urban environment, however, I'll go out and find a decent one. It doesn't work so well. Where's Bristol? Come on, where have you gone? So what we've done this time round is to amend the method. Rather than just focusing on green spaces and rights of way in the urban environment, rights of way don't provide the main access to places and resources. It's the streets, it's the roads, and it's the urban paths. We haven't looked at streets and roads and public realm, but we have looked at urban paths. Urban paths data is from the OS Ordnance Survey Master Map. It's not open data, we can't show you, but we have looked at it to see, can we actually identify more water side in the urban environment, which is probably accessible because of proximity to an urban path, giving us more information than we had previously. So not brilliant in Bristol, I'm afraid, but we can see that we're pulling up information about this section here that's gone green, and it says this is accessible. Oh, but it's not accessible. What does that mean? We will explain this. There's no explanation at the moment. It means in the All England assessment, it's classed as not accessible because there's no right of way or green space. But in the urban assessment, there is an urban path close by, so that might well be providing access to the water side. It's a probability. It could be obstructed by a building, it could be obstructed by a fence, or so on. But there is a probability that that is accessible, at least to its side. So we filled some of the gap for the urban environment. It doesn't go all the way, but it goes a lot further than previously. We also have a lot of statistical information which will emerge at some point in spreadsheet form. But again, at LSOAs, we've brought out the information like this. So each LSOA has lots and lots of statistical information about the resource in there and how much of it is likely to be accessible by amounts and by percentages. If I zoom out, we will see that this urban data obviously only exists for urban areas. So what you're looking at here is the urban mapping domain. So within here we have the urban assessment. Outside we do not, but everywhere is covered by the All England assessment. We've added in some information about flood risk, both from rivers and seas and from surface water, and the surface water information in particular is very detailed, and that's sort of setting up the scene for where we might go next with blue infrastructure work that we want to do. But more on that another time. The next layer is designated and defined areas. These are reference layers. I won't go through all of these, but for example, we've brought together information about biodiversity, significant biodiversity sites. So if you click on each one, it will tell you what it is. So here we have a SSSI, but we also have the ancient woodlands, NNR and LNR. So if you're looking at a green infrastructure polygon on map 1 and you want to know, does that have a biodiversity designation status, this is how you might find out. And likewise with historic assets, there aren't any there, but we've brought together, never find one when you need one. Oh, here we go. Here. So again, here is a historic environment asset. It's a scheduled monument. That's probably a scheduled monument as well. So if it's something else, then that will also appear. We've got parks and gardens, registered parks and gardens, not public parks and gardens, registered parks and gardens. That has caused confusion in the past. Scheduled monuments, battlefield and World Heritage sites on this occasion. We've got other information about, particularly around, we've separated out the European designated sites, local authority boundaries, which of course give great context, which a lot of people will need. So if you click on that, it will tell you which authority you are in, and so on. National character area boundaries as well, specifically open access land. If we got so there, each individual polygon of access land is identified, and it will tell you which access land data set that data came from, whether it's the Crow access land or the Section 15. So lots of reference layers. And then beyond here, we have 3 inequalities. These are major pieces of work that we've undertaken, and actually one of the reasons we're a bit late getting the data out, we had to fix a problem. But we've looked at inequalities in supply versus some other important factor. So the first one is the accessible natural green space inequalities and index of multiple deprivation. The second one is again inequalities in space versus population density. We are not inferring that these are causally related. So a lack of green space doesn't lead to a higher level of deprivation per se, but there are 2 things occupying the same space at the same time, and we want to understand their spatial relationships. The third inequalities assessment that we did was the one I skipped over earlier on, which is the combined green space and public rights of way inequalities layer. I'll do this one first, actually. It's only one map. So if we bring up this map, this is based on, I think, again, it's a 5 square kilometre grid basis. And what we're trying to find out here is we're looking at supply in terms of low, medium, high. This is explained partially in the user guide. It will be explained in more detail as a method in the method statement, but go for it for now. These are thresholds. Each line is a threshold. So L1 is the least favourable, least of both. So that's less than 5% of the area is covered. Sorry, not with these. There's a threshold here. It's about with green spaces, I think it's about 10, and that's about 100. So there's a low, medium, high in terms of supply, and likewise in terms of rights of way, 1, 2, and 3, and those are in meters. I can't remember exactly what they are, 20,000 and 40,000, I think, approximately. So what we're interested in here is, what scenario does each square fit into? So if we click on the red ones, the L1s, what we've got are places that square there has the least least of both, the least supply of green space, the least supply of public rights of way, which could well mean that communities living in the square might live in England's Green and Pleasant, but actually they can't go there, or it doesn't appear that there's much access opportunity. Whereas over here, we've got a different scenario. That's H3, so they've got the most of both. It's important to know, however, that H3 doesn't mean everything's sweet. It just means it appears to be in a better position than the other scenarios. The quality of that supply and whether or not it meets local access needs is a completely different question. To establish that, you'd have to go there and start conversing with the local community. But it gives us a basic pattern of where high and low supply across the country is, or combined supply. If we go on to the accessible natural green space inequalities in IMD, these mirror the angst levels. So we've got doorstep through to sub-regional. I'll just zoom in to do this, probably about here, something like that. So if we bring, no, I know what I'll do. I'll go a bit further out, look to Rochdale, and bring up this layer. Where have you gone? Somewhere around here. So if we bring up the doorstep layer, we can see again, this is based on LSOAs, not grid squares. So we're trying to establish at an LSOA level what the relative inequalities in terms of green space are, and whether or not that corresponds with what level of deprivation as measured by the index of multiple deprivation. So these are the L1s. These are decile 1 or 2, most deprived, and under 5% green space and its attendant buffer. So how are these made up? If we go back to the asset layers, first of all, we'll bring up the green spaces and zoom in a bit, and we can see there's not a lot of green space, accessible green space in that area. And if we bring up the attendant buffer at 200 meters, we can see it's at some distance. So with this LSOA, there's a slight overlap here. With the rest of them, there's a little bit down here. With this one, there is nothing. So that's decile 1, most deprived, and least access. So if you're interested in trying to identify communities where there is a high level of deprivation, there's a low level of green space supply, shall we target that place to create new green space, or to green the local environment, try and do something about the quality of that environment in this deprived area? L1s are a good place to start, but don't forget, L1s are a statistical geography. They do not represent actual communities. It's an interesting place to start, but you've got to understand, that place in its context. This is a statistical product, and that's all. It helps. It doesn't give you the answer. If you change the parameter and we look at not IMD, but we look at population density, you will get a different picture. This one, because it's population density, it's looking for those places where the population density is at its highest. So an L1, if I zoom out, try and find an L1, you see there's a lot less of them in this area. So this L1 here has a very high population density, over 12,000 people per square kilometre. So the actual benchmark is 10,000 and above, and it's also less than 5%. So you potentially got high demand, low supply. Again, if you want to alleviate supply and demand issues, this sort of information might give you a start. You can't stop at the boundary, but let's look at this place and what's around it. So those are the inequalities layers. I'm starting to come towards the end of my allotted time span, so I'm going to cut through a few things and come down to these 3 layers at the bottom here. These are still in development. These are some of the newest layers that we've done. So we've created a lot of information about accessible green spaces, and there they are. These are publicly accessible. These are being provided, most of them are being provided for public access, and the vast majority will be in some form of public ownership, not all of them, but most of them. So we also know there are lots of sites out there which permits people, it's private land, it could be public land, it could be owned by a public sector organisation, it could be owned by other parts of the local authority, not the parks and gardens, it might be owned by a charity, it can be owned by private sector companies, but some form of permissive access is provided, and we'd like we're starting to gather information on where that land is, land with permissive access. At the moment, we did invite, I think it was over 60 organisations to provide us with data. With some of those organisations, the data couldn't be made open government licensable, so we couldn't incorporate it this time around. But we have managed to get some data from the National Trust and from a selection of the Wildlife Trust. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's Cheshire, Derbyshire, Beds, Bucks and Oxfordshire, I think Essex, possibly Kent, I can't remember. But the rest of the country, we have yet to get data. And of course, there are those other organisations, including public sector and private sector, who also provide permissive access to some of their estate. If you're listening and you're one of those organisations and you'd like to see your data on this map, if you'd like to combine it with these other organisations, then please do get in contact because we'd like to talk to you so we can see we've got some data where we've been provided, and it fills some of the gaps when it comes to the accessible spaces as well. There's often a complementarity. These aren't parks, they are just places that provide some sort of permissive access. You might be able to walk around it, but you might not be able to walk everywhere across that land. But as I say, this is a start. We'd like more data. If you've got some and you can help us, let us know. We had a gap last time. I have to zoom out and go to the coast. In fact, we'll go to Norfolk. Why not? Nice day. And here we are on the Norfolk coast. We wanted to put some coastal data into version 1.1. We had to pull it late stage because we had issues with licensing. So this time around, we tried to bring back the coast. And what we found is actual data about the coast, which is open government license, is quite rare. You know, there's a lot of data out there which says it's open, but all you can do is actually see it. When you're trying to get the data, you can't get your sticky mitts on it. So what we've managed this time to do, and we're looking to do more, I think in the future, is bring together information from the Environment Agency about, it says bathing beaches, it's actually bathing waters. There are some inland bathing waters and they're in the data as well. But here we have a bathing beach and an attendant buffer. The reason it looks a bit weird is because the actual data is what we call point data. If you click on the green point, it will tell you what the actual bathing water is. So it was designated, it's Sea Palling, designated in 2002. It's in North Norfolk, and the sewerage undertaker is Anglian Water. What it doesn't tell you is, does the beach start here and end here? Does it start here and end here? Or is it just a little bit just there? We don't know. The data doesn't tell us. So what we've tried to do is to say, well, look, you know, although it's a point, first of all, we'd like you to see that it's there. The actual coast, these assets aren't just there for the tourists. They're also important local community assets. They will be well used by the local community and Sea Palling. So when you're looking at the green space and access situation in that place, don't forget the beach has a role to play, and at local level you might well be able to establish where exactly it is. We haven't been able to do that, so we buffered it with a 1 kilometre arbitrary buffer around that, matching the sort of the local angst buffer, saying at about 1 kilometre, if you're within this 1 kilometre of this beach, the chances are that's having a significant draw, not just on the tourists but on the local community as well. It's providing some form of a service. The other coastal data sets we've managed to include the developing. It's not finished yet, of course, it doesn't cover the whole coast, but where it has been designated as of September 2022, when we had to close this version down, then we've included both the coastal trail and the coastal margin, so to tell you what the section is when you click on it. And we've also incorporated some data from the Ordnance Survey on the foreshore. So I'll just get rid of that and bring that up. This starts to give you some understanding of the extent and location of the intertidal zone. That might be accessible, at least permissibly, or it might not. It may be safe, it may not be safe, we don't know. But here before shore, we can match that against the coastal trail, and we can match that against the bathing beaches as well. And finally, at 14:53, I'm very nearly on time. Active sports, play, recreation. There is information in map 1 about assets that provide sport and active play. In fact, I need to zoom out and go somewhere where there's going to be lots. So give me a second. I'll find myself a city. Not many in Norfolk. We'll go back to Manchester. So here we are in Manchester. And if we bring up the map 1, we can see all these red things here are described in the data other sports facilities. There is a problem with the green space data in this respect, because some of these red spaces are in fact buildings themselves. They're not actual sort of outdoor opportunities. There's one in here somewhere, I can never find it. Nonetheless, they are in the data, so therefore we don't police what's in the data, we're just using it. If you click on it, it will tell you it's a sports facility and it's 35% man-made. This one over here is probably a lot higher, 75%, and that's mostly building, and that one there is 93%. You're talking built facilities here. All we can see here is there are built facilities for sports, there are facilities for outdoor activities, so that's a playing field. The problem is that some sports facilities are probably playing fields, some playing fields are probably sports facilities, and both of them sometimes should probably be parks, but aren't actually registered as parks, and there are some which are completely redundant. So it's difficult to see what's going on with this data. It gives you a polygon, that's important, but can we understand more about what's going on in terms of sport, recreation and active play, as it were? And the answer is yes. So what we've brought together is the OS data together with information from Sport England, their active places data. Not all of it. We've focused on trying to identify those places which appear to be providing some form of outdoor experience, which is publicly accessible. However, publicly accessible in this context doesn't mean the same thing as it does in the accessible green space context. There are different definitions, and it's important to understand them. If we pull up that data, we can see this is also a point data set, so there are no polygons. If you click on this point here, it tells you that what we've got there is a lawn tennis club. It's managed by the actual club itself. It provides outdoor tennis. There is public access, but actually the type of access, as it says here, you probably have to be a member of the club or that community association in order to use it. So it's not just turn up and play. There is public access, but there's a restriction on that. Nonetheless, you can see that this data is telling us there is something there in terms of sport, which is not in the OS data, and where there is a correspondence of the OS data and a point. This point probably refers to all that facility there. So if we bring that one up, this is owned by a higher education institution. It's providing artificial grass pitch, and I suspect there may be also two artificial grass pitches, 3 artificial, 4 artificial, 5 artificial. They're outdoor, but they're artificial. There's also a tennis court and so on. So there's an awful lot going on in that space. But again, public access, in this case, it could be pay to play. So you can turn up, pay your money and use the facility, or for some of them, it may be, again, you have to be a member of the club. If there's nothing in the data, if I just get rid of map 1 and bring up this here. So if there's no actual Sport England data, it's not because Sport England don't know about it, it's because we've filtered it out. And that could mean that either A, it is a building, it's not offering any form of outdoor opportunity that we know about, or B, it might be private. In other words, it's not providing any form of public access either. And sometimes the point and the actual polygon don't quite match, because the point will go on to, usually it's the place from which these facilities are managed. It's probably the easiest way to think about it. And that may or may not be, several of these things might be managed from one point. So if you bring it up, it quite often tells you. In this case, it doesn't. So nonetheless, some further contextual information about these outdoor opportunities, including golf courses. We don't have any form of information about play spaces. They are included. So if we click on that one, that's a play space, and all we know is that it is a play space. Whereas a lot of these opportunities here come with quite detailed information about what's going on. This picks up on some of the resources which aren't in the OS data. So there's additionality here. And we've sorted out those which provide some sort of access versus those which don't, or at least we think we do. Right, I think I'm at 14:57. So I said I'd speak for about 50 minutes. I've gone slightly over. So what I will do is now we'll move into the final couple of slides before I stop sharing and we move into the Q&A. I just want to say, I have mentioned version 2.1, probably I think in January next year when it comes out, not December, but we are building significant new content. So this time next year, even an hour isn't going to be long enough. I'm going to need longer. We will be upgrading a lot of the information, and key to that is to know that version 1 is on census 2011 time, and we're keeping it on census 2011 time. But version 2 will be on census 21 time, which will allow us to start to see the impact of population change on some of the data that we have. So we will be importing. People have been asking me, when are you going to start using census 21? Well, the answer is as soon as we can get our filthy sticky mitts on it, because some of the data that we need isn't yet quite available. I'm trying to confirm that with the ONS as to when it will be. But we're also looking at, we're moving away from access and infrastructure and so on, starting to look at an ecosystem services, probably climate change driven agenda, so urban functionality and needs assessments. A major project around urban habitat and naturalist mapping, more on that another time, but trying to create a product which will assist in the development of urban nature recovery action going forward. And even for connoisseurs of version 1.1 will have noticed that the health data has disappeared. That doesn't mean we're not interested in health. It just means that we are planning to work with the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities to develop a much better, much more focused health and green infrastructure module. So again, I hope to have something ready for January next year. So my final slide is to say thank you for listening. I hope that's been informative. Remind everybody that this is part of the Natural Capital and Ecosystems Assessment Programme. They are my major sponsor. But we are now going to move into the question and answer session. So I'm going to come off screen share. Do forgive me for a moment, this always goes wrong. And hopefully you'll be able to see my colleague David Greenwell. We're going to go through questions and answers from here, and David's going to chair that forward.
Hello everyone, my name is David Greenwell. I also work on the Green Infrastructure project. Thank you for that, Martin. That was a pretty comprehensive review of the whole project. So yeah, we're just going to do a short question and answer session for the ones that have been published throughout the call. So I'm going to go through the most liked comments, so the ones that have got the most traction. We'll try and answer first. We'll go through as many as we can. There may be some that we decide to kind of take away with us and give a better answer either on the website or in another way. And some of the really technical ones I'll try and answer, and then I'll hand back over to Martin for the kind of more policy based ones. So we'll get started. So the first question, I'm going to start with, are there any plans to bring together local wildlife sites as part of a future iteration? I'd say so. One of the things that will probably become clear with answering these questions, there are certain themes around data access that we've had to deal with, and licensing for open government license isn't necessarily always possible for data sets. And I think that's one of the things we've hit with local wildlife sites. There's often quite sensitive data, so we haven't been able to include them at this stage. We'd like to, but yeah, it's just not been possible because of the licensing restrictions and publishing. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that, Martin.
Yeah, I think am I audible still? Okay, so yeah, obviously local wildlife sites data is very important. It is maintained by the network of local wildlife, environmental record centres across the country, of which there are, quite a few. So it's one of those, the data is in the hands of a whole range of organisations. It's not open data. We can't publish it. We can't even have it. We're not licensed to have it at the moment. And in fact, most local environmental record centres will be using such data as part of their income generation. So if we had it and published it, you can imagine they would not at all be happy about that, because we're cutting their financial throats. So no, we aren't planning to incorporate it. And as far as I can see, in the foreseeable future, we won't be able to.
Okay, so the next question, and again, it's a similar theme with data access, but it's with regards to blue infrastructure. Does the map feature SUDS solutions and their different types? If not, will it in the future? And again, this map doesn't include SUDS. It's an area that we do want to look into, but the data has not been available so far. Hopefully in the future it will be, and we'll be able to include it. Question on, so the DEFRA Magic Map versus this Natural England plan. Why are there two products? Are there plans to change, for example, merge both the maps together? I'll throw that one over to you, I think, Martin.
Okay. So Magic has a job to do, and it does that job. For the product that we have, it's not necessarily the most friendly way of getting the data out there. And on top of that, The actual green infrastructure mapping was originally at least conceived to support the Green Infrastructure Standards Framework and ultimately its rollout. And we took the decision to keep all the information about the standards in one place on a dedicated Green Infrastructure Standards web portal. So no, we are keeping the mapping alongside all the other green infrastructure information on the GI portal. But the actual data itself is, as I've said, open government license data, and I well imagine that parts of it at least will start to emerge in other forums in the future. So we're not precious about it. It's there to use. We are keeping it where we like it, but some of the information we have is also on Magic, and there are issues about duplication. We don't want to duplicate, but I think we're very keen to keep the green infrastructure mapping alongside all the other green infrastructure information for the time being.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So a question here on the data, which I'll try my best to answer. So are all data sources dated, and are there any auto updates or dynamic updates as sources change? So in the user guide, we've listed what the data sources are and when we've captured that data from. So for example, the public rights of way map, we gathered all of that the most recently in 2022. So we've listed that the data was captured in 2022, and we've done that with all of our input data sets where we can. And so from a kind of update scenario, auto updates or dynamic updates is something we would like to move towards in the future. At the moment, we're not doing it. We're doing things on an annual cycle, so we'll update the data annually, but we want to move to a more kind of PostGIS SQL database type format, which would hopefully enable us to use to kind of do those dynamic updates as it's going forward. So at the moment, no, but we hope to in the future.
Definitely.
Sorry, the questions keep, as people vote on their favorite questions, they move around. So here's another question. Are there layers that match to the new Natural England GI standards, i.e. access to green space within 15-minute walk and mapping able to calculate percentage green cover in urban areas, the minimum 40% target, and that can be calculated for wards or other defined areas? I know there is one for tree canopy cover.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've got anything to come on that,
okay.
Martin?
At the moment, the answer is no, because these have been developing in real time, and in reality, we've got to work out in spatial terms exactly what they mean. So percentage green cover, we have the greenness grid that sort of gives you information towards that, but there are questions about what do we mean. Is it percentage green cover everywhere? Are we interested in certain land use contexts more than others? Is it really about residential areas, or is it also, you know, is it all settlements and so on? So there are, for me, some questions to answer yet. What exactly does this mean, and what will that mean for what we'll be able to sort of assess and map? In terms of the 15-minute commitment, again, we're doing some work at the moment, working through from a spatial perspective, from an assessment perspective. What does that mean? So it's not in the maps at the moment. There might not actually be a map. This is more about extracting statistical information. So we're working on it. It will emerge over time. Was there a third part to this?
I think the third part was to do with tree canopy cover.
Yeah, similarly, trees. Yes, it's interesting. Literally within the last few days, information about trees, data about trees has started to emerge. There's an awful lot of work going on across the country looking at trees as opposed to woods. So these are trees outside of woods. Unfortunately, up until now, actual open data that is comprehensive enough, covers all of England and just looks at trees, hasn't been available to us. So tree data is a gap. I've said from the beginning, we don't have tree data, so even our greenness grid probably doesn't take account of trees as opposed to woods. And I'm hoping going forward over the next months and year or so, that situation may change as data becomes available. I'm expecting some open government license tree canopy data to be published by Forest Research imminently. There's the data that's come out in the last few days really from Friends of the Earth as well. So the situation will change. When we've got data, we can start to think through what does it mean in terms of monitoring tree canopy cover, but it's work to be done in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. So another one is a kind of practical question about getting images out of the website. So is it possible to extract map images as PDFs so that we can use in presentations, for example. If I want to combine some map layers for a ward, can I save as an image? So we are currently developing a way of extracting PNGs and JPEGs from the website. It should be a kind of extraction tool on the website itself. It's quite a crude way of doing it, but if you just want a PDF of something in your local area that you've taken off the website, Control P will bring up a dialog box, and you can save whatever is on your window of your computer at that point as a PDF. So that's the kind of the way of doing it at the moment, but we're hoping to improve that going forward. We're also hoping to make the data all available as web map or web feature services. So you can kind of get the data as an image without having to download it all in a GIS context. So again, that's another area we're developing, because we're becoming a lot more aware of the kind of downloading a large geodatabase or something like that is a bit restrictive. So we're trying to make it a bit more user-friendly in that sense. Next question. Are the health warnings re-accuracy clear so that the public won't assume areas are accessible when actually they may not be? So this we've had to include, well, this is all included in the user guide. To try and make the website as user-friendly as possible, we tried to declutter the kind of landing page for the map itself, because there's a lot of information going on there with the base map and the various modules. But with the user guide, if you go to the section, the introductory section, on that page is a big section on the sort of general disclaimer and sources of accuracy and the situation on the ground reflecting the situation in the data, and then any known sources of error that we know of or we've come across, that's also included in there. So I would say that's, if you're interested in kind of pointing people in a direction of a map, but also want to make sure that they understand the issues with accuracy, the user guide is the place to start. Do we need to wait for OS Greenspace dataset to improve over time, or is there a way for local authorities or authorities generally to help improve the dataset from their own more accurate local knowledge and data?
Mm-hmm.
Anything to come on that, Martin?
Yeah, okay. So we all know and love the OS Greenspace data. It's an incredibly useful product, but we all know it's not perfect. No data product is. We are actually undertaking a piece of work at the moment looking into what we call margins for error, and also an assessment of missing land, to try and understand what sort of data confidence we have. It's not just with the OS data, it's with the other data sets, or some of them as well. So we'll have more in-depth information on data confidence. The way to get the OS Greenspace data updated to particularly update things which have changed, or to enable the OS to input data on sites which are missing, is actually to use the reporting link. There is a link to, it's actually a complaint form, but it's not really a complaint. There is a form you can fill out on the OS website telling them that you think that there is some data that they need to input, and they will undertake a formal process to check that. And if they find there is something that they can input into the OS data, then they will. And over time, therefore, the more people that do that, and the reason why I think a lot of places are missing is because nobody's told the OS that it's missing. If you tell them, they'll investigate. If they agree, they will put it in. So the OS Greenspace data can only improve if people tell the OS, well, pretty much tell the OS that there's something missing or something needs to change. Long term, we're talking a few years, there are major changes going on in terms of OS data at the moment, which I personally find very interesting indeed. So they're kind of moving away from master map over a period of time and towards something called the National Geographic Database, the NGD. And part of the process there is not only to change some of the ways they actually gather data. So the gathering information on amenity green spaces, places which are accessible, but they're not necessarily formal parks. The OS Greenspace data is not very good at that, and the OS freely admit it. So they're trying to improve the way that they identify different resources on the ground and input those into the data itself. They're also identifying, there's a whole program of identifying those bits of master map where there's an outline around the space, but there's no actual land use information about that space. So in terms of master map, it's invisible. You can see it's there, but you don't know what it is. And quite a lot of those, I suspect, are various different sorts of missing assets. So lots of gaps on the OS map are also being filled, but ultimately it will end up in the National Geographic database. So I think, you know, the future of green space data itself is going to change, because the NGD is more structured around being able to sort of interrogate the whole thing as a database and extract those bits of it you're particularly interested in. So for us, that will be very useful, because we will be able to specify the sorts of things we want to know about and the sorts of parameters within which we want to know about them. Send off a request, the big machine in Sky will do the thinking, send us a link, and we'll be able to download the data. So I think the prognosis going forward is the data is going to get better, but I also think it's going to get a lot more sophisticated in how we can use it.
Great, thank you. The other thing I'd add as well, because this is national, it gives everyone access to the same kind of starting point. But if you know your local authority, for example, has its own data that's a lot better or more detailed, because this is all open government license, you can take our data, add your data to it, so it kind of becomes yours and you can work with it how you want to. So we're aware of the limitations, but take our stuff, use it how you want it, and improve on it if you can. So are there any layers on soil quality or type? Not at the moment. We haven't really touched on this, and again, there's issues with access to data and data availability. It's out there, but we can't do much with it at the moment, and I don't think it's kind of in the near future. It's something we're going to be looking at. Do the various layers, accessible green space, for example, have to have a solid fill, or could they have a level of translucency to see the OS layer below? So you can, on the website itself, you can change the translucency. There's a slider bar, so you can make them as see-through or opaque as you want. And then if you download it into your own GIS, again, you can play around with that. You can make whatever color, however you want to appear. You can do that. There's kind of no limit really. Is the derived data, such as the greenness grid and private garden data, available for download? Yeah. Yes, if it's on the website and you can see it, you can see the attributes, then you can download it. Everything on there is OGL, so everything is accessible. So if the greenness grid data, for example, if you're really interested in that, you can download that and it will be available. So another question. For me, GI is another prism to ensure landscape and local nature recovery supply meets demand. How do you intend to ensure other teams in Natural England coordinate with this GI mapping? I'll probably pass that one over to you, Martin.
Okay, so there is a lot of internal dialogue ongoing at the moment and into the future. So various teams that have a variety of things, obviously, that they need to deliver. This is one of them, but crucially, what we want to do is to ensure that we're linking things up, so we're not pursuing things in isolation. So linking across from green infrastructure to local nature recovery, making sure that net gain fits into the family, and so on is important for us. Some of these things are still in development, so we're not totally sure how they're going to work together, but ultimately they will. So green infrastructure is one of the tools in the bag, and I think we should see it that way. It's not to be done in isolation. It's there to help us do the bigger picture.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. Next question, can subsets of GIS data be exported for specific areas, for example, a single local authority or region, to help reduce potentially large and unwieldy file sizes? So this is something we're very aware of. The download at the moment, you just get everything, which, and aside from being massive, there'll be stuff in there that isn't relevant for everyone. Currently, that's the only way to do it. We are kind of limited a little bit by internal capacity and that kind of thing with getting this data available, but we are working on it, and hopefully in the future we're going to have things available at the different modules. So for example, if you are interested just in green space, but you don't need any of the things to do with blue space, then you can just download the green space data and that module. We don't yet have a way of and this will hopefully be a future thing, because I know other various Natural England datasets you can do this, so you can import shape files and just have the data for that area. At the moment, again, we don't have anything that can do that, but in the future, hopefully we will. Are any layers available to LPAs, which I'm going to assume is local planning authorities, so that they can be added to the map layers already used? So, and again, I'd say, because this is all OGL, anything you see there, you can have, you'll have to go through the download process, but if there's anything up there, then it's available. Are there any instructions re how to download and play with the data? So the best place to go, I think, is the user guide that tells you where to get the data from, and then how to download it will be on the data.gov website. At the moment, it's available as a Esri geodatabase format and as a geo package, which is an open source, open data geo consortium type file. So if you have an Esri account, so if you use ArcMap or ArcPro, the geodatabase is probably the place to start, and you can access things through that. But if you don't have access to any Esri software, you can use open source software, things like QGIS or RStudio, and the geo packages are probably the easiest place to start there. So this question, I guess, goes back to kind of source data. So we have 2 accessible golf courses in Bournemouth and Christchurch and Poole, and they're not showing up as accessible green space. How do we get these included, as there is an absence affecting the results for other layers in our area? Excuse me. I would say the best place to start is to go to the OS and kind of make them aware of what these golf courses are. So as you say, they'll know they're golf courses, but they won't know that they're accessible. So if you can report that to them, we're kind of reliant on the source data. So if the OS are mapping things incorrectly or perceived to be incorrectly, we're going to pick up on the areas are going to kind of be carried on through to what we're mapping. Anything to add, Martin?
Yeah, okay. So when you said that, I'd be interested to know what you mean by they are accessible. The way we've identified accessible green infrastructure is typologically. Golf courses are not mapped as accessible green infrastructure. Most of them are private land. There may be rights of way across them, but that doesn't count either. It's the space that we're interested in. So a golf course would only appear as accessible on the map if in fact it's also something else which is classed as an accessible green space. So if it's part of if it's enclosed within a public park, for example, it should pop up. If it is access land or partly access land, it will pop up, but it won't pop up simply because it's a golf course.
Great. Okay, so where have I got to? So is it possible to display parish boundaries? So we've not included parish boundaries on the site. We don't have that data. I mean,
sorry, Mark, just on that, we've got quite a few geographies on the site, so there are local authority boundaries, but we also use MSOAs, LSOAs, and we've got various different grid square systems and so on like that. So there is in my head, there's a slight risk if you have the more and more different geographies you have. For us, the more and more difficult it gets to manage. We don't have wards, we don't have parishes. Parishes in particular, of course, don't cover the whole of England. Not everywhere is parished, so it would be a map with gaps. But there is data out there on these boundaries. So if you download the data from the data.gov, you can fit it. You can impose a geography, ward geography or a parish geography on top of that, and you can cookie cut the data for those that you're interested in. So we haven't incorporated, but that doesn't mean you can't.
Sorry, my mic was muted there.
Yeah.
So I'll just say we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes, but we've got time for a couple more questions. This is one that Martin touched on in the presentation, but will the data be updated once the 2021 census data becomes available? And the short answer to that is yes. We have plans for a major update later this year, including the 2021 census data. We're just waiting for all of the data that we need to become available, essentially. And once that's happened, we'll get to it and hopefully update it. So there's a question here. So have you looked at any of your derived data sets, such as access to water, in relation to the All England strategic mapping? I might pass that to you, Martin. That's not a project I've come across.
No, I'm not sure what that is. All England strategic mapping.
Okay, so
I think the answer is no.
so this will end on this one. Is there a layer that, I think we sort of touched on it, is there a layer that can show within 15 minutes of green or blue space, or is there a proxy for it? Obviously the 15-minute zone is getting a lot of traction at the moment.
Yeah, so the proxy, there isn't a specific layer, if I come live. So there isn't, we don't have a particular, this is still, it's new, it's in development, this is a new commitment, so we're having to work through what does that actually mean, and what are we going to do about it in the mapping terms. The nearest proxy would probably be, it depends what you mean by 15 minutes, and there are various interpretations of that. The broadest interpretation would be if you take the angst layers with their attendant buffers at doorstep, neighbourhood and local, the three lowest ones, and put them together, you've got a rough approximation of what the 15-minute zone might look like. But at the moment, there's still quite a lot of work that we want to do to bottom this one out.
Yeah, and just to clarify, that's the 200, 300 and 1 kilometre to buffers. So that's those three buffers. So we'll end there. If there are any questions that we've missed, or we're going to go through and we'll try and get back to as many people as we can. There's some technical ones in there as well, which hopefully will be answered either in the user guide or the method statement, things on the different classifications and things like that. That will all be in the method statement that will be published soon.